Hi, Justin Haskins here for another Stopping Socialism video. Today's topic is 3 great arguments against socialism. Now I'm just going to preface all of this by saying that if you're really interested in making great arguments against socialism, you have to know your audience. It all depends on who you're talking to. These arguments are arguments that I've used in the past against people who call themselves socialists but aren't necessarily really into the literature. They're not always Marxist socialists. A lot of times these are just sort of your run-of-the-mill Bernie Sanders supporters, people like that, people who don't necessarily understand the history. They're not members of the Democratic Socialists of America or anything along those lines. If you're dealing with someone who's a really hardcore Marxist, then these arguments probably aren't going to work. They've heard them before. But for most of the people in your life who call themselves a socialist, this will work pretty well. So let's just first start off by saying, each of these things should be used together. I don't think that you should just take one of these arguments and then have it stand on its own. It should be 3 arguments all together. Now, argument number 1 is this. Socialism has never worked anywhere it has ever been tried, ever. Okay? And that in and of itself should be a pretty powerful argument. All right? Socialism, no matter where it's been tried in many different cultures. It's been tried in Asia and in Europe and in the Americas. It doesn't work regardless of religious beliefs, the time period, the technology, the language, the various cultural aspects to things. It doesn't matter. Wherever socialism has been tried, it has failed. And that's a really important argument to make. 167 million people in just the past 100 years alone, 167 million people have been killed, exiled, or imprisoned by socialist and communist parties. So socialism hasn't just failed a little bit. It's failed spectacularly. It has been literally one of the most deadly ideas ever created in the history of human civilization. So socialism has never worked. That's argument number 1. Now, a really important argument to add to argument number 1, it has to come along with it, is that Scandinavian socialist countries, that's how they're often referred to, aren't actually socialist countries. And they're not the utopias that so many other people say that they are. We're talking about Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, countries like that. Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and many other people, they'll look at those countries and they'll say, yeah, these are perfect little socialist utopias. But here's the thing. Go to the Heritage Foundation World Freedom Rankings. Look at the Cato Institute, their rankings on economic freedom, and you'll see that when you dig down deep into the policies that exist in these countries, do they have some socialist big welfare programs? Absolutely. They have single-payer health care. They have free college tuition in many of these countries. Yes, that's 100% true. But if you're looking at the whole picture, you'll see pretty quickly these are not socialist countries. They have market-based economies. Up until very recently, they had lower corporate tax rates than we have here in the United States. They tax everybody in the society. They do have high tax rates, but they tax everyone. Middle-class people, many middle-class people by American standards in places like Sweden and Norway and Denmark pay extremely high tax rates, more than 50% of their income. Lower-income people pay a value-added tax, as does everybody in society, of 25% on goods and services throughout the economy. So when you're looking at taxes, it's not like the rich are paying most of the tax burden. In these countries, the tax burden is spread out much more so than it is here in the United States, which is really in complete contradiction to socialist principles. If you're looking at corporate tax rates, they have very low corporate tax rates, relatively speaking. They have balanced budgets. In places like Sweden, they have school choice programs, which is something that socialists here in the United States don't support. In Norway, they get much of their national income in Norway, or much of the government's revenue in Norway, tax revenue, comes from pumping natural resources out of the ground to sell fossil fuels, right? That's not something that socialists here in the United States support. Again, balanced budgets. They have relatively few regulations. They have lots of financial freedom in these countries for banking and things like that. So if you're going to call these countries socialist countries, then you need to completely redefine socialism to mean something that it doesn't. And if you're going to call these countries socialist, then, well, you have to call the United States a socialist country. So Not only that, but these countries are not utopian countries. So not only are they not socialist, but they're not utopian countries. If you're going to look at cost of living, if you're going to look at living standards, it's not higher there than it is in the United States. In many parts of the United States, it's actually better than in Scandinavian countries. So the idea that these countries are just these perfect little socialist utopias just isn't true. If you're a middle-class person, you are much better off living in the United States than you are living in Sweden, Norway, or Denmark in many cases. And in addition to that, even if you were better off in Norway or Sweden or Denmark, it wouldn't be because they're socialists. They're not socialists. Okay, so that's a really important argument to make. It complements argument number one, because you're going to get all these people out there that say, hey, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, those are the examples that you're looking for of a socialist country, a socialist success story. But in reality, they're not socialist success stories because they're not socialist nations. So argument number one, socialism has never worked anywhere it's ever been tried. Argument number two, Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, etc. are not socialist utopias. They're not even socialist countries. Argument number three, even if you could find a socialist country somewhere in the world that is successful, it would be deeply immoral. Now, no socialist society has ever worked, ever. It always inevitably leads to tyranny of some form, often with blood in the streets. But even if you could find a socialist country that would work, it would be a deeply immoral system. And here's why it would be a deeply immoral system. In order to have a socialist society, you need to have collective ownership and management of property. At the very least, you need to have collective management of property. You don't necessarily need to have collective ownership, although that's the traditional understanding of socialism. Now, if you have collective ownership and management of property, then that means that somebody has to actually be making the decisions, right? You either have to have an authoritarian government at the top, which is often what happens in socialist societies, or you need to have democratic system for doing this, either a representative government or a direct democracy that controls the property. Here's the problem. Regardless of whether or not you believe in a democratic socialist society or an authoritarian socialist society, it doesn't really matter how the property is controlled and managed for this particular argument that I'm making here. The point is this. It has to be managed collectively in some way, which means that if you're a minority in that society, if you're in the if you're a moral minority, what I like to call a moral minority, or if you're a religious minority, or whatever it is, if you're in the minority, you're at the mercy of whatever the majority of people in that society decide, or whatever the ruling class in society decides. So if they decide, for example, that we're going to have a socialized healthcare system, and you happen to be a nun, a Roman Catholic nun, or a devout Roman Catholic who believes in the Roman Catholic Church's teachings on sexuality. Now, I'm not a Roman Catholic, okay? But if you are a Roman Catholic, then, and you're a devout Roman Catholic, then you believe that it is a sin, a deep sin, a mortal sin that separates you from God to support or promote or partake in contraception. Okay, sexual contraception. We're talking about birth control pills, condoms, or any form of abortion, anything like that. It's a mortal sin to take part in it. And yet, in a socialist society, in a socialized healthcare system that has birth control, that has condoms, that has abortion, and just about every democratic socialist that I'm aware of in the United States today wants all of those things paid for by the government, you're forcing people who believe that those things are deeply wrong. Again, put aside for a moment whether you think they're deeply wrong. Lots of people believe they're deeply wrong. You're forcing those people in a socialist society to not only live in a society where these things exist, that would be one thing. You're forcing them to actually pay for it and to be a part owner of it and to pay the salaries of doctors who are engaging in these activities. So you can see how this creates all sorts of moral problems. You are forcing people in socialism, and there's really no way around it. And it's not just healthcare issues, it's all sorts of issues. You're forcing people in a socialist society, minorities in that society, to partake and engage in and even become owners of systems that they believe are wrong. Another good example of it that has nothing to do with religion, at least in many cases, is what do you do with people in a socialized agricultural system who believe that it's wrong to kill animals for food, right? For either religious reasons or just personal reasons. They think it's wrong to kill cows for food. They're vegetarians. What do you do with people who belong to PETA, the people for the ethical treatment of animals? What do you do for these people? In a socialized agricultural system, in a society that wants to eat meat, which is basically the vast majority of societies on the face of the planet, if you happen to believe it's immoral and wrong to kill animals, then in a socialized economy, you have to kill those. You have to pay for the killing of those animals and the meat packing plants and the meat distribution facilities and all the rest of it. You see, so you're forcing people to partake and engage in activities that they believe are deeply immoral. And so for that reason, I believe that socialism isn't just wrong. It isn't just destructive. It isn't just bad. It's not just a bad system. Socialism is an evil system. I know that's a really strong word, but if you think about it, it's evil. It's wrong. Isn't it wrong to force people to violate their religious beliefs? Isn't it wrong to force people to kill animals if they think that it's wrong to kill animals? Isn't it wrong to force people to violate their conscience? Of course, in Western civilization, we all agree that those things are wrong, and yet people don't connect socialism with that problem, even though socialism is intricately tied to that problem. All right, we could go on and on and on, but for now, let's just leave it there. I'm Justin Haskins. This has been a Stopping Socialism video. If you're interested in seeing more videos, if you like the work that we do, please share our videos, like our Facebook page, share our variety of posts that we have at stoppingsocialism.com. Go to stoppingsocialism.com and share our material there. And of course, subscribe to us on YouTube as well. Our videos are going to be there. I greatly appreciate you taking the time to view this video, and I encourage you to share it with others. Together, we can stop socialism.